Are you installing your own laminate flooring? Here are some tips to After choosing the type of laminate, you need to know: how much laminate flooring material do I need? The basic formula to find that answer is this. Multiply the length of the room by the width. Add 10%. Then round up to the next full box or package. Which way should your flooring face? For better looking results, try to orient your flooring towards the greatest light source, or the longest wall. Before placing any flooring down, decide on your starting wall. Then determine how your last row of boards will end up. Divide your room's width, minus the manufacturer's recommended expansion space, by the board width. This will tell you how many boards it will take to reach the opposite wall. If you have less than 1/3 of a board left, it may not lay flat. To remedy this, add the leftover amount to the board width. Then divide in half. This number is the width your starting boards and ending boards should be trimmed to. Before starting your install, you will need to prep your floor space. The floor cannot have high spots. Scrape them off or sand them down. Low spots should be filled. Place the first row of underlayment. You will lay down the new rows as you go. It's important to take into consideration the thickness of your baseboard trim. Your expansion space must be less than this so your trim will cover it. As you install your flooring, use spacers to maintain the proper expansion space. Laminate installation requires a lot of cutting. Most of these cuts will be end cuts. There are a number of ways to make these end cuts. You can use a shear, like the Easy Shear. Or you can use a chop saw. When you make an end cut at a wall, rotate the board 180 degrees. Mark it. Cut it. Then rotate it back and install. For a better looking result, try to stagger the end cuts as you lay your flooring, making them as random as possible. Besides your board cutter, you will find these tools essential: a hammer, a pull bar, tapping block, utility knife, tape measure, square, spacers, jigsaw, and a pencil. Other tools which you might find helpful: an undercut saw, a chalk line, skimmer, no flip clip. With care and the proper tools, you too can successfully install your own.
The first two films in our series on how to prepare a subfloor and your underlay options. But before we get started on laying our laminate floor, there are a couple of things to consider. Firstly, you need to decide which way you're going to lay your boards. Laying the boards towards a light source makes the joints less visible, and laying the boards across the width of the room will make a room feel wider. We're going to be laying our boards the length of the room, which is going to make the room feel longer. However, if you're laying your new floor across an existing wood subfloor, you're going to need to lay the boards across the old floor for a more solid and stable result. Setting out is roughly laying out the floorboards to work out how they'll be arranged and to plan for obstacles like pipes. To start, set out the very first row to check you won't be left with a very short length at the end. If you are, just trim the very first board. Now we need to check that the last row of boards won't be too narrow. You don't want a tiny slither of board at one end of the room, as it will look untidy and can be hard to cut. We can work this out with a simple sum. Don't forget to factor an expansion gap of 10mm at either end of the room. If you divide the length of the room by the width of your board, it will tell you not only how many boards you'll need, but the leftover width of the final board that you'll have to cut. If the last row turns out to be less than a third of a board, it will be easier to cut the very first row down as well, so that the cut boards are not too narrow. Finally, you should also think about obstacles like radiator pipes. Cutting the boards will be easier and tidier if the pipes fall in the middle of a board's length or width rather than a joint. So set out the boards, see where the pipes fall, and trim the boards accordingly. We're going to show you how to lay this Simply Fit laminate flooring. Now, locking systems do vary between manufacturers, so always check the instructions on the pack before you start.
Right, we've talked about expansion gaps, and this is needed as laminate and solid wood flooring expands and contracts due to the changes in temperature and humidity. So to stop your floor buckling, you must leave a 10mm gap for laminate, and to make it easier, you have these expansion spaces.
Lay the first board in the left-hand corner over the underlay with the tongue nearest the wall. Put a 10mm expansion spacer against the end of the board and at intervals along the wall. Lay the next board end on, making sure that the tongue of one board sits snugly in the groove of the previous one at a 30-degree angle. Lower the board and lock into place. Carry on doing this until you get to the end of the row. You'll probably have to cut a board to fit the last row. To work out exactly the correct size for the last board of the row, lay it directly on top of the last board you laid. Then take a third board and use it as a template. Press it snugly up against the wall, and with an expansion spacer in place, use the other end of the board as a template and mark the board you're going to cut with a pencil. When you're cutting your boards, it's always best to do this outside or in another room so that you don't get any dust or debris on your subfloor or underlay. And always remember to try and keep a window open to keep the room ventilated. First, clamp your board to a workbench, then cut the board. We're using a jigsaw, but you could also use a fine-toothed handsaw. If you're using a jigsaw, make sure you use a laminate blade and have several spares to hand, as the cuts will get rougher as the blade deteriorates. Don't forget to wear your dust mask and safety goggles. Now it's just a matter of fitting the cut board into position, and that's your first row done. To create a pleasing look, make sure the joints of the next row are not in the same place as the first, but form an overlapping pattern. Cut a board or use the offcut from the end of the previous row. Repeat this pattern across the whole floor. Doing this will also make your new floor stronger. To start the next row, angle the cut board against the first board with the cut end by the wall, then add your expansion spacer. Press forward and down to lock into place, then just repeat this along the whole row. Alternatively, if you've got some help, clip a row of boards together, then put the whole row in place. Just repeat this process across the whole room. We'll come back to how you lay the last row in a bit, but before that, it's like you'd have come across either a doorway or some radiator pipes. Don't worry about it, as they're dead easy. First, the radiator pipe. Lay your board next to the pipe, and at the centre of the pipe, draw a line across the width of the board. Now lay the end front onto the pipe and mark where the centre of the pipe intersects the line you've drawn. This is where you'll need to drill your hole. Use a power drill with a 32mm spade bit. This will give you a big enough hole to allow for expansion, as a standard radiator pipe is 15mm. Again, do this in another room or outside, and don't forget the dust mask and goggles. Next, draw 2 lines from the hole to the edge of the board at a slight angle, like this. Just cut along the lines with your saw and remove the wedge, but make sure you keep it. Fit the board into place, glue the wedge in, then wipe off any excess adhesive immediately. The next obstacle you may come across is a door frame. If your door opens into the room, you need to check that it will have enough clearance over the new flooring and threshold bar. If not, you'll need to remove the door and trim it down. Top tip: don't try and cut the flooring to fit. You'll get a much neater finish if you trim the architrave like this, so the underlay and flooring fit underneath. Just use a chisel to remove the waste piece of wood. Right, that's pipes and doors tackled. On to the last row. To cut boards to fit this row, place the board you want to cut directly over the previous row like this. You can hold it in place with some tack. Use a third board as a template. Press one edge of the template to the skirting board and use the other edge to mark the board underneath. Top tip: do this in the actual place the board will go, just in case your walls are slightly out. Once you've cut the whole row, slot them into place. The last things left to do are the finishing touches, the flooring trim,